Yeah, about this the EU referendum. They say you have to be nearly 60 to have voted in the last in-out referendum. Well, I voted in that referendum. I was 12. My mum had forgotten her glasses. And we were a Labour household. And as we left the polling station, she said to me, you did vote in, like Harold Wilson said. And I said, no, I voted out, like Tony Benn said. Now, Tony Benn wasn't right about much, but he asked 3 good questions about the common market. Who appointed these people? What are the limits to their power? And how do we get rid of them? And I'm not sure we've had satisfactory answers to those questions. Of course, the common market was a good idea. It was just a bit far-fetched. It began in the 1950s with 6 traumatised countries crouching in the rubble of war-torn Europe. Next to them was a pile of corpses, tens of millions of corpses. And in those circumstances, your next move has to be right. And they decided that wars were caused by nationalism. So, dissolve nations, abolish the nation state, create one Europe, no more war. 60 years on, nations are still here. So divisions between these nations. In Athens right now there's this joke. We've got volunteers in armbands goose-stepping through the capital. What more do the Germans want? So the movement to abolish the nation state in the continent that created the nation state is contradictory. It's doomed. It's like watching a snail try to win a 3-legged race. It's a pretense. Nations will always pursue their self-interest first. That's what kept Britain out of the common market in the 1960s. France didn't want us. And when we entered in 1972, we were led by Ted Heath, and he was supported by Dennis Healey and Roy Jenkins. And they'd all been junior officers during the war. So for them it was very progressive and enlightened to make a treaty with their sworn enemies, Germany and Italy. But you'd have to be 90 to think like that now. And as soon as we joined, we started negotiating opt-outs and exemptions, which is kind of pointless. It's like me having a sex change and living secretly as a man. And this thing, the EU, has never really worked because it was dreamed up in the 1950s as a cure for the 1930s. But it was the wrong cure. Fascism wasn't caused by nationalism or the nation state. It was caused by economic stagnation, which handed national sentiment from moderates to the extremists. So the EU isn't programmed to solve the problems of the 21st century, and we know that because no one's copying it. Even places that easily could, like the Arab world, where they have one language, there's no political union, there's no chance for centralised parliament. Or South America, they have 2 main languages. In the EU we have 24. But the South Americans aren't copying us. They're sticking with the thing that we invented earlier, the nation state. That works. And the EU is clearly unnecessary. To trade with China, we don't need MPs in China, or Chinese MPs here. We don't need a shared currency with Russia to trade with Russia, or to trade with America. We don't need the same system of tax and regulation. We did have that once, and what happened? War. It took a war to destroy that failed vision of shared government. So the EU belongs in the past. It's like a dotty old pensioner. It gets confused. It thinks it's done things that it hasn't done, like keep the peace in Europe. It hasn't got any peacekeepers. NATO keeps the peace in Europe. The EU might as well tell us it's won the Champions League or the Eurovision Song Contest. And it gets confused about democracy too. Is it democratic? I'm not sure. I have an MEP, but I can't name him. No one in Britain can name their MEP, but we can all name our star sign. So we have more faith in the zodiac than in the European Parliament. And the EU famously pays its parliamentarians twice. Basic salary plus €300 each time they enter the building in Brussels or Strasbourg and leave 2 minutes later. Now usually to earn €300 for a quick bit of in and out, you need to go to Amsterdam. But the EU takes great pride in its inefficiency. It does everything twice if it can. It's got 2 salaries for its MEPs, it's got 2 parliament buildings, it's got 2 presidents, 2 currency zones. And when there's a new treaty subject to a popular vote, we get 2 chances to say yes. So the EU, being this dotty old pensioner, likes to cling to ideas that have failed, like the euro, which began as an experiment. And we now know what that experiment proves. It proves you shouldn't leave economists and bureaucrats alone in a room with just a biro and the back of a fag packet. Now the euro enthusiasts say that the euro has been good for trade, which it has if you trade in tear gas, riot shields and rubber bullets. They also say it's brought European citizens together. Yeah, the dole office is heaving. But the euro doesn't work because it's inflexible. It gives you the same exchange rate from the bottom of Portugal, next to Africa, to the top of Finland, next to the Arctic Circle. It's as if every farmer in Europe were told to plant his seeds on exactly the same day every year. A currency needs to be attached to a national economy, so that when the economy slides, as they do occasionally, the currency devalues, and that makes the country more appealing to foreign cash and foreign investment and foreign tourists. It's a bit like strip poker. The more you lose, the more attractive you become. It's a self-righting mechanism. And it doesn't work for the euro because there's zero growth. A stationary ball won't bounce. But the euro is very popular with one group of people, with forgers. That's because it's got buildings on it, not faces. And buildings are easier to copy. And the reason there are no faces on the euro is to prevent these national divisions from being inflamed. Which face do you choose? Which painter is better, Leonardo or Ronnie Wood? Who's a better novelist, Victor Hugo or Andy McNab. These debates would never be resolved. So the euro is staying because the EU doesn't like change. It doesn't like new things. It doesn't like the internet. It stops us using it. The internet means that every shop in the world is now open around the clock on your kitchen table. You can shop where you like. But the EU says no, you can shop where we like. In Europe, with high costs, high regulation, and MEPs getting paid twice to add to the paperwork. If you shop elsewhere, you'll get fined. If you buy a car in America, from America, you'll get fined. If you buy solar panels from China, you get fined. It's not called that, it's called a tax or a tariff. But it's basically a parking ticket that keeps the marketplace clear for the lumbering mammoths of industrialised Europe. They protect the EU, and the EU protects them. That's what it's about. That's why Tony Benn hated the EU. And everyone on the left should hate it. It's a rich man's club that kills trade in Africa and the West Indies. It freezes out newcomers. It won't give them access to the market. If you look at some of the main exports of Africa and the West Indies, coffee, sugar, chocolate, then think of the companies that sell coffee, sugar and chocolate. Nestle, Tate & Lyle, Cadbury. Where's the African company? Where's the West Indian company? Oh, look, oil. Tons of oil in Africa. Now name an African oil company. This is their stuff, and we won't let them sell it. And that's why Africa is stagnating. That's why you have Boko Haram. That's why you have people crossing the Mediterranean on a plank of wood they bought for $2,000 in Turkey. The EU stifles growth. It does that to protect its rich paymasters. So if you support the EU, you're supporting the rich against the poor. And these paymasters are corrupt. We can see that with this referendum at the moment. The multinationals are saying they'll close factories if Britain votes to leave. This is rotten borough politics. It's the rich landlord telling his tenant farmers who to vote for, or he'll evict them. And the multinationals did this in the 1990s when the euro was being formed. They said to Britain, join the euro or we're off, we'll sack the workers. And we didn't join the euro. And they didn't leave, actually. They hired more workers. So it's perfectly safe for us to leave. We're the fifth economy of the world. And the reason we need to leave is for the sake of trade. Now, our famous seat at the negotiating table is a flop. The EU can't do a deal with India, which is the largest market for spirits in the world, but it puts a 150% tax on Scotch whisky because the EU has fluffed the negotiation. And Scotch is our most significant alcoholic export since Richard Burton. It could be bigger, but the EU won't let us trade even with India, where we have so much shared history. Because at that time we went over there for a long weekend and outstayed our welcome by about 200 years. But what we have left with India is a shared culture and a common language, English. And thank God that wasn't invented in France, or we'd only be able to use it for 35 hours a week. So we and the Indians are eating our picnic on the same table, but we can't talk to each other. We're banned from trading with India, which is incredible. There are thousands of British citizens of Indian extraction who could do the deal tomorrow, but it's illegal under EU law. The same goes for all Commonwealth countries. And what's happened in the last 70 years is that the British Empire has dissolved and regenerated like Doctor Who. And it now exists within our own borders. So we have colonies or communities from all over the world who are now living here, governed from Westminster, as their great-grandparents were. And they've been joined by people from Russia and the Middle East and South American countries. So we now have 100 languages spoken in some of our cities, 200 languages in the big cities, and people don't like that, or some people don't like it. The question is, are these people going back? No. Is there an upside? Yeah, trade. Our connections make us the biggest trade bark in the world. And these people who've come here are our future. They're a kind of golden cradle born out of our slightly embarrassing history. We've inherited a fortune, but we can't touch it because the EU funnels all our trade through the stagnant bottleneck of Brussels into 27 other countries whose economies aren't suited to ours. We have a concept economy. We're good at banks and media, science, medicine, films, music. We've got very little in common with, say, Portugal or Belgium or Bulgaria, certainly not with the ploughshare economies of the Warsaw Pact. They've fallen behind because they spent half the 20th century in a trance saying, we're in paradise, join us. Then they woke up one day in 1989 and said, we're in hell, can we join you? And we said, yes, but I'm not sure it's sensible anymore. Of course, we'll still trade with countries all across Europe, but we don't need to have permanent deeds of association with them. I can go into a Polish supermarket and buy some beetroot, but I don't start a business with the Polish guy. Next door there's a travel agent, I buy a ticket. I don't extend the trade block to him and the Polish guy, and we don't all go into partnership with the next guy along, who's an ironmonger, just because we need a new latch for the cupboard. But that's what the EU is like. It's 28 economies locked together just because 60 years ago some old man in Luxembourg or France misdiagnosed the 1930s. It's mad. It's also dangerous. Now, some people call the EU the EUSSR, like it's a Soviet tyranny. Bit paranoid, I used to think. Until I read a proposal by a high-level group. A high-level group is a body that makes law in Brussels. The euro was invented by a high-level group. And they propose media councils in the EU to regulate the press, and one power they seek is removal of journalistic status. What that means is that a journalist who offends the EU will have no job, no pen and paper, no phone, no website, no social media, no communication with anyone. And this would affect us all. We all consume journalism, we all feel free to talk to journalists, and to silence them is the hallmark of dictatorship. If you cut out the tongue of the reporter, society bleeds to death through the mouth. So this referendum isn't just about being richer and freer and more open to global trade, it's a bit more serious. I would say we're standing at the baptismal font of a tyranny, and I'm not sure we want to christen the devil. And I voted to leave last time, and I will vote to leave again. Our third opportunity may not come in the cosy surroundings of a polling station, maybe on the streets, on the barricades. I don't want that. I don't want to have to pass Nigel Farage a petrol bomb, even though he's always good for a light. So I think, let's do it now. Let's get out. Let's get out of this corrupt, narrow-minded, parochial, fat cats cartel. Let's be ourselves instead. Let's be Britain. Let's embrace the future that our past has given us. Because this is what we are, to use a phrase from another context. We are the world.